Who are the owners of monetary assets and who are the debtors? Statistics distinguish three sectors: the state, enterprises, and private households. In this graph, the relation is expressed in percent of the gross domestic product. The state is the biggest individual debtor in the economy, but it is not the only debtor. In the first decade after the war, the state managed to build up a considerable fortune on the right side, while keeping the indebtedness on a rather low and even decreasing level. The state, which had about one-third of all assets in the beginning, has become poorer and poorer since 1960, and since the 70s, debts are continuously on the rise. Today, the state holds only about 6% of the total of assets. The second sector concerns enterprises. While enterprises had built up higher assets, the indebtedness developed much faster. If money was hoarded, it would disrupt the circulation and cause gaps in the supply and demand cycle. Therefore, monetary savings have to be fed back into the economy via loans. Otherwise, the economy would be jeopardized by deflationary recession. However, due to the mathematical law of compound interest, monetary assets and debts must grow. And if the state refrains from making debts, then someone else has to shoulder the burden. The increase of indebtedness of the enterprise sector was particularly strong between 1991 and 2005. The largest increase in monetary assets on the other side had the private households, which now hold two-thirds of all assets. In principle, this would be appropriate, because private households stand for those who work and have a rightful claim for the biggest share. By the way, the apparent sudden jump of private indebtedness since 1991 was not caused by a dramatic event in the economy, but is only due to a different method of processing statistical data. The question is, of course, how are these fortunes divided? This can be seen in this graph. All private wealth is listed here: real estate, monetary funds, capital equipment of companies. Monetary assets make about one-third, 32%, and more than a half consists of real estate. The majority of people don't possess real estate. All real estate is owned by about one-fourth of the population. The total sum of wealth is quite considerable and amounts to 9,920 billion German marks in 1993, or expressed in euros 4,560 billion. A survey is carried out every 5 years, and the allocation of wealth shows interesting results. There are different groups of households with the labels A, B, C, D, E, F, G. The first two groups, A and B, stand for about half of the population, but they own only less than 10% of the total wealth. The major parts of wealth concentrates on the two last groups, with a share of about 50%. Half of the wealth is in the hands of 10% of the population, and the other half in the hands of 90% of the population. If one considers that the top of the graph ends at 5 millions, the wealth column of a billionaire would be 200 times as high as the highest column in this graph. Of course, billion columns are very thin, but by their very height they are quite relevant. Here is a comparison of growth rates during the last 5 decades in the sectors: monetary assets, gross domestic product, and net wages. In the first 2 decades, the relation of increase between net wages and monetary assets was about 1 to 3. In the meantime, it has climbed up to 1 to 50. Since the growth of the national product is only nearly linear, net wages have fallen back since the 80s. They still have grown, but with ever smaller growth rates. That means that the working population is less and less participating in sharing the results of the economic output and its increase. On the other side, monetary assets gain the more. Why is this development of monetary assets so dramatic? Since from a macroeconomic view, monetary assets and debts are identical figures, they cannot but grow at the same pace, because all savings that someone puts aside from his income cannot only be lent out, but they must be borrowed by somebody else in order to close the monetary cycle. Otherwise, the money would be missing in circulation and arouse a deflationary recession. That's why all surplus money has to be fed back into the economy. This detour via loans, however, causes an ever bigger volume of interest flows. In order to make it more comprehensible what this means for an individual participant in the economy, we can divide the sum of all debts by the number of participants and compare this share with his annual disposable income. The income columns for the given 3 years are kept equally high, although the absolute figures are quite different. They are given below the respective columns. In this way, the ratio between income and debt share can be compared. In 1950, it was 1:1. In 1975, the debt share was twice as high as the income, and in 2000, the ratio between income and debt share was 1:5. In 1950, the share of interest for these debts was 6%, and an average worker had to work for it about 3 weeks, without having borrowed money on his own. The larger part of this interest share goes on top of monetary assets, and by lending it out again, it increases the column of debts. In 1975, the share for servicing the debts went up to 13%, and in the year 2000 it was 28%, and an average worker had to work more than 3 months for it. It has to be mentioned here that these figures can be backed by respective data. In fact, however, the interest share in prices is higher because interest for the entrepreneur's own capital, especially tangible capital, are not included. These can only be estimated since there are no reliable statistical data available. Today, we can assume an interest share in prices of about 40 to 45%. Of course, these are average figures. Depending on the kind of produce or service, these shares can differ within a broad range. They are very low in services that do not require much capital, and they are very high in rents for real estate and in produces from processed mineral oil, for instance, where the interest share can amount up to 70% and more. Well, everybody is delighted about getting interests credited on his or her savings account at the bank, but no one seems to ponder about the question where those interest payments come from.